Let me begin by observing first of all that 9,000 was the sum of years which had elapsed since the war which was said to have taken place between those who dwelt outside the Pillars of Heracles and all who dwelt within them. Of the combatants, on the one side, the city of Athens was reported to have been the leader and to have fought out the war. The combatants, on the other side, were commanded by the kings of Atlantis, which, as I was saying, was an island greater in extent than Libya and Asia, and when afterwards sunk by an earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the ocean. I have before remarked in speaking of the allotments of the gods that they distributed the whole earth into portions differing in extent, and made for themselves temples and instituted sacrifices. And Poseidon, receiving for his lot the island of Atlantis, begat children by a mortal woman, and settled them in part of the island, which I will describe. Looking towards the sea, but in the centre of the whole island, there was a plain, which is said to have been the fairest of all plains and very fertile. Near the plain again, and also in the centre of the island at a distance of about 50 stadia, there was a mountain, not very high, on any side. In this mountain there dwelt one of the earth-born primeval men of that country, whose name was Evenor, and he had a wife named Leucippe, and they had an only daughter who was called Plato. The maiden had already reached womanhood when her father and mother died. Poseidon fell in love with her and had intercourse with her, and breaking the ground, enclosed the hill in which she dwelt all round, making alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, which he turned as with a lathe, each having its circumference equidistant every way from the centre, so that no man could get to the island, for ships and voyages were not as yet. He himself, being a god, found no difficulty in making special arrangements for the centre island, bringing up 2 springs of water from beneath the earth, one of warm water and the other of cold, and making every variety of food to spring up abundantly from the soil. He also begat and brought up 5 pairs of twin male children, and dividing the island of Atlantis into 10 portions, he gave to the firstborn of the eldest pair his mother's dwelling and the surrounding allotment, which was the largest and best, and made him king over the rest. The others he made princes, and gave them rule over many men and a large territory. And he named them all. The eldest, who was the first king, he named Atlas, and after him the whole island and the ocean were called Atlantic. Now, Atlas had a numerous and honourable family, and they retained the kingdom, the eldest son handing it on to his eldest son for many generations. And they had such an amount of wealth as was never before possessed by kings, and is not likely ever to be again, and they were furnished with everything which they needed, both in the city and the country. For because of the greatness of their empire, many things were brought to them from foreign countries, and the island itself provided most of what was required by them for the uses of life. In the first place, they dug out of the earth whatever was to be found there, solid as well as fusile, and that which is now only a name, and was then something more than a name, or a chalcum, was dug out of the earth in many parts of the island, being more precious in those days than anything except gold. There was an abundance of wood for carpenter's work, and sufficient maintenance for tame and wild animals. Moreover, there were a great number of elephants in the island, for as there was provision for all other sorts of animals, both those which live in lakes and marshes and rivers, and also for those who live in mountains and on plains, so there was for the animal which is the largest and most voracious of all. Also, whatever fragrant things there are now in the earth, whether roots or herbage or woods or essences which distill from fruit and flower, grew and thrived in that land. Also the fruit which admits of cultivation, both the dry sort, which is given us for nourishment, and any other which we use for food. We call them all by the common name pulse, and the fruits having a hard rind, affording drinks and meats and ointments, and good store of chestnuts and the like, which furnish pleasure and amusement, and are fruits which spoil with keeping, and the pleasant kinds of dessert, with which we console ourselves after dinner when we are tired of eating, all these that sacred island which then beheld the light of the sun brought forth fair and wondrous in infinite abundance. With such blessings the earth freely furnished them. Meanwhile they went on constructing their temples and palaces and harbours and docks, and they arranged the whole country in the following manner. First of all, they bridged over the zones of sea which surrounded the ancient metropolis, making a road to and from the royal palace. And at the very beginning they built the palace in the habitation of the god and their ancestors, which they continued to ornament in successive generations, every king surpassing the one who went before him to the utmost of his power, until they made the building a marvel to behold, for size and for beauty. And beginning from the sea they bored a canal of 300 feet in width and 100 feet in depth and 50 stadia in length, which they carried through to the outermost zone, making a passage from the sea up to this, which became a harbour, and leaving an opening sufficient to enable the largest vessels to find ingress. Moreover, they divided at the bridges these zones of land, which parted the zones of sea, leaving room for a single trireme to pass out of one zone into another, and they covered over the channels as to leave a way underneath for the ships, for the banks were raised considerably above the water. Now, the largest of the zones into which a passage was cut from the sea was 3 stadia in breadth, and the zone of land which came next of equal breadth. But the next 2 zones, the one of water, the one of land, were 2 stadia, and the one which surrounded the central island was a stadium only in width. The island in which the palace was situated had a diameter of 5 stadia. All this, including the zones and the bridge, which was the 6th part of a stadium in width, they surrounded by a stone wall on every side, placing towers and gates on the bridges where the sea passed in. The stone, which was used in the work, they quarried from underneath the centre island and from underneath the zones on the outer as well as the inner side. One kind was white, another black, and a third red. And as they quarried, they at the same time hollowed out double docks, having roofs formed out of the native rock. Some of their buildings were simple, but in others they put together different stones, varying the colour to please the eye and to be a natural source of delight, which went round the outermost zone they covered with a coating of brass, and the circuit of the next wall they coated with tin, and the third, which encompassed the citadel, flashed with the red light of orichalcum. The palaces in the interior of the citadel were constructed on this wise. In the centre was a holy temple dedicated to Plato and Poseidon, which remained inaccessible and was surrounded by an enclosure of gold. This was the spot where the family of the 10 princes first saw the light, and thither the people annually brought the fruits of the earth in their season from all the 10 portions, to be an offering to each of the 10. Here was Poseidon's own temple, which was a stadium in length and half a stadium in width, and of a proportionate height, having a strange, barbaric appearance. All the outside of the temple, with the exception of the pinnacles, they covered with silver, and the pinnacles with gold. In the interior of the temple, the roof was of ivory, curiously wrought everywhere with gold and silver and orichalcum. And all the other parts, the walls and the pillars and floor, they coated with orichalcum. In the temple they placed statues of gold. There was the god himself standing in a chariot, the charioteer of 6 winged horses, and such a size that he touched the roof of the building with his head. There were also in the interior of the temple other images which had been dedicated by private persons, and around the temple on the outside were placed statues of gold of all the descendants of the 10 kings and of their wives, and there were many other great offerings of kings and of private persons coming from both the city itself and from the foreign cities over which they held sway. There was an altar too, which in size and workmanship corresponded to this magnificence, and the palaces, in like manner, answered to the greatness of the kingdom and the glory of the temple. Leaving the palace and passing out along the 3, you came to a wall which began at the sea and went all round. This was everywhere distant 50 stadia from the largest zone or harbour, and enclosed the whole, the ends meeting at the mouth of the channel which led to the sea. The entire area was densely crowded with habitations, and the canal and the largest of the harbours were full of vessels and merchants coming from all parts, who, from their numbers, kept up a constant sound of human voices, and din and clatter of all sorts, night and day. I've described the city and the environs of the ancient palace nearly in the words of Solon, and now I must endeavour to represent the nature and arrangement of the rest of the land. The whole country was said by him to be very lofty and precipitous on the side of the sea, but the country immediately about and surrounding the city was a level plain, itself surrounded by mountains which descended towards the sea. It was smooth and even and of an oblong shape, extending in one direction 3,000 stadia, but across the centre inland it was 2,000 stadia. This part of the island looks towards the south and was sheltered by the north. The surrounding mountains were celebrated for their number and size and beauty, far beyond any which still exist, having in them also many wealthy villages of country folk, and rivers and lakes and meadows, supplying food enough for every animal, wild or tame, and much wood of various sorts, abundant for each and every kind of work. I will now describe the plain, as it was fashioned by nature and by the labours of many generations of kings through long ages. It was for the most part rectangular and oblong, and where falling out of the straight line followed the circular ditch. The depth and width and length of the ditch were incredible, and gave the impression that a work of such extent, in addition to so many others, could never have been artificial. Nevertheless, I must say what I was told. It was excavated to the depth of 100 feet, and its breadth was a stadium everywhere. It was carried round the whole of the plain, and was 10,000 stadia in length. It received the streams which came down from the mountains, and winding round the plain and meeting at the city, was there let off into the sea. Further inland, likewise, straight canals of 100 feet in width were cut from it through the plain, and again let off into the ditch leading to the sea. These canals were at intervals of 100 stadia, and by them they brought down the wood from the mountains to the city, and conveyed the fruits of the earth in ships, cutting transverse passages from one canal into another and to the city. Twice in the year they gathered the fruits of the earth, in winter having the benefit of the rains of heaven, and in summer the water which the land supplied by introducing streams from the canals. As to the population, each of the lots in the plain had to find a leader for the men who were fit for military service, and the size of a lot was a square of 10 stadia each way, and the total number of all the lots was 60,000. And of the inhabitants of the mountains and the rest of the country there was also a vast multitude, which was distributed among the lots, and had leaders assigned to them according to their districts and villages. The leader was required to furnish for the war the 6th portion of a war chariot, so as to make up a total of 10,000 chariots. Also 2 horses and riders for them, and a pair of chariot horses without a seat, accompanied by a horseman who could fight on foot carrying a small shield, and having a charioteer who stood behind the man-at-arms to guide the 2 horses. Also, he was bound to furnish 2 heavy-armed soldiers, 2 slingers, 3 stone shooters, and 3 javelin men, who were light-armed, and 4 sailors, to make up the complement of 1,200 ships. Such was the military order of the royal city. The order of the other 9 governments varied, and it would be wearisome to recount their several differences. As to offices and honours, the following was the arrangement from the first. Each of the 10 kings in his own division and in his own city had the absolute control of the citizens, and, in most cases, the laws, punishing and slaying whomsoever he would. Now, the order of precedence among them and their mutual relations were regulated by the commands of Poseidon, which the law had handed down. They were inscribed by the first kings on a pillar of orichalcum, which was situated in the middle of the island at the temple of Poseidon, whither the kings were gathered together every 5th and every 6th year alternately, thus giving equal honour to the odd and to the even number. And when they were gathered together they consulted about their common interests, and inquired if anyone had transgressed in anything and passed judgment, and before they passed judgment they gave their pledges to one another in this way. There were bulls who had the range of the temple of Poseidon, and the 10 kings, being left alone in the temple, after they had offered prayers to the god that they might capture the victim which was acceptable to him, hunted the bulls, without weapons but with staves and nooses, and the bull which they caught they led up to the pillar and cut its throat over the top of it, so that the blood fell upon the sacred inscription. Now on the pillar, besides the laws, there was inscribed an oath invoking mighty curses on the disobedient. When, therefore, after slaying the bull in the accustomed manner they had burnt its limbs, they filled a bowl of wine and cast in a clot of blood for each of them. The rest of the victim they put in the fire after having purified the column all round. Then they drew from the bowl in golden cups, and pouring a libation on the fire, they swore that they would judge according to the laws on the pillar, and would punish him who in any point had already transgressed them, and that for the future they would not, if they could help, offend against the writing on the pillar, and would neither command others nor obey any ruler who commanded them to act otherwise than according to the laws of their father Poseidon. This was the prayer which each of them offered up for himself and for his descendants, at the same time drinking and dedicating the cup out of which he drank in the temple of the god. And after they had supped and satisfied their needs, when darkness came on and the fire about the sacrifice was cool, all of them put on most beautiful azure robes, and sitting on the ground at night over the embers of the sacrifice by which they had sworn, and extinguishing all the fire about the temple, they received and gave judgment, if any of them had an accusation to bring against any one. And when they had given judgment, at daybreak they wrote down their sentences on a golden tablet, and dedicated it, together with their robes, to be a memorial. There were many special laws affecting the several kings inscribed about the temples, but the most important was the following. They were not to take up arms against one another, and they were all to come to the rescue if anyone in any of their cities attempted to overthrow the royal house. Like their ancestors, they were to deliberate in common about war and other matters, giving the supremacy to to the descendants of Atlas. And the king was not to have the power of life and death over any of his kinsmen, unless he had the assent of the majority of the 10. Such was the vast power which the god settled in the lost island of Atlantis, and this he afterwards directed against our land for the following reasons, as tradition tells. For many generations, as long as the divine nature lasted in them, they were obedient to the laws and well affectioned towards the gods whose seed they were, for they possessed true and in every way great spirits, uniting gentleness with wisdom in the various chances of life and in their intercourse with one another. They despised everything but virtue, caring little for the present state of life and thinking lightly of the possession of gold and other property, which seemed only a burden to them. Neither were they intoxicated by luxury, nor did wealth deprive them of their self-control, but they were sober and saw clearly that all these goods are increased by virtue and friendship with one another, whereas by too great regard and respect for them they are lost, and friendship with them. By such reflections, and by the continuance in them of a divine nature, the qualities which we have described grew and increased among them. But when the divine portion began to fade away, and became diluted too often and too much with the mortal admixture, and the human nature got the upper hand, they then, being unable to bear their fortune, behaved unseemly, and to him who had an eye to see grew visibly debased, for they were losing the fairest of their precious gifts. But to those who had no eye to see the true happiness, they appeared glorious and blessed at the very time when they were full of avarice and unrighteous power. Zeus, the god of gods, who rules according to law and is able to see such things, perceiving that an honourable race was in a woeful plight, and wanting to inflict punishment on them, that they might be chastened and improved, collected all the gods into their most holy habitation, which being placed in the centre of the world, beholds all created things. And when he had them together, he spake as follows.